long before Starbucks measured our existence in seasonal beverages and before we scrolled ourselves into existential confusion. Survival was not a passive state of being. It was a part-time job with poor benefits and no central heating. In those early flickers of human life before crop rotation and door hinges, a small, rather unsexy choice could mean the difference between extinction and, well, us. Sitting here now, together, loosely tangled in a blanket, whispering history into the moonlight. One such life-altering decision. Porridge. Imagine it. A damp morning in Neolithic Britain. The kind of morning where your mammoth hide blanket lets in a suspiciously ambitious draft, and the fire sputters with the last gasp of yesterday's damp twigs. A woman, let's call her Marga, is squatting near the embers, poking a thick glob of something into a clay pot. That something is what we now might call gruel, though calling it that would be considered a hate crime by modern food influencers. But Marga, clever in ways that would absolutely demolish a standardized test, figured out long before recorded history that if you soaked crushed grains in water overnight and then heated the resulting paste, it became not only tolerable, but actually carried her family through another foraging-less week. Those early bowls of proto-oatmeal were not culinary masterpieces, but they were warm, energy-rich, and unlikely to give you food poisoning, which, in prehistoric terms, basically made her a Michelin-starred wizard. This humble decision, the morning ritual of adding a few more pebbles worth of barley into yesterday's survivor sludge, laid the groundwork for something bigger. Domestication. Food that could be stored, shared, rehydrated, and heated by fire. That meant less desperate sprinting after bison and a bit more time spent not dying. Porridge, you see, is one of history's dull yet undefeated champions. It's the edible equivalent of a dusty library book, easy to ignore, but oddly essential. It gave us predictability, and with predictability came settlement, and with settlements came, tragically, landlords. But Marga didn't worry about zoning laws or pest control meetings. She just wanted her kids to eat something that didn't scream when thrown against a rock, and she wasn't alone. Across the globe, humans were independently discovering the sticky elegance of boiling grains. Chinese millet mush, Egyptian emmer paste, Andean quinoa soup. All different names for the same idea. Make it mushy, make it last. Hope it fills the gap where the bear attack trauma lives. Let us pause mid-simmer to appreciate how these soft, squelchy meals were not merely acts of nourishment, but defiance. A middle finger, if Neolithic people used fingers for that, to hunger and instability. You can't read about early survival without hearing the loud, comforting squelch of a communal pot being stirred. What these early eaters might not have known is that they weren't just preparing food, they were reprogramming biology. The act of digesting boiled grains allowed fewer calories to be spent in digestion, which meant more calories could go to growing brains and, controversially, inventing indoor meetings. Eventually, this mush for brains lifestyle created space for thinking. Not lofty philosophical thinking at first, more like, what if we kept the grains here and hit the wild pigs over there? But that simple math became maps, and those maps became countries who fought over stew recipes for centuries. Even today, in every bowl of oatmeal, congee, or even a smug quinoa salad, there are echoes of Marga's early morning triumph, a quiet rebellion against uncertainty. So next time you grumble about soggy breakfast or consider skipping lunch, remember that you are the heir to 1,000-year legacy of strategic blandness. And that, dear stranger under the covers, is something rather beautiful. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now rest easy and let the soft steam of ancient porridge carry us gently into the glow of the next discovery. Long before humans figured out how to bake bread or binge-watch documentaries about bread, they had a much more crucial survival concern: not being mistaken for lunch. Picture it. You're a scrappy little Homo erectus, trotting through the East African savannah, bones still sore from evolving into bipedalism, when suddenly, what's that? Oh, just a saber-toothed cat that hasn't had its morning espresso, or anything resembling breakfast, in several days. In those moments, survival was less about heroic decisions and more about incredibly pedestrian ones. Hide behind that rock or that tree stump. Take the high ground or the low brush. Sneeze now or hold it until Mr. Murderfangs trots away. The human experience, very early on, was a riveting drama of mundane choices, all performed with the rising sun and the ever-watchful eyes of creatures who considered you a chewy delicacy. And so began humanity's long-celebrated relationship with risk management. You see, long before spreadsheets and helicopter parenting, early humans dabbled in an art form we might now call creative cowardice. Not that they were spineless, of course. Brave, yes, but also aware, clever, subtly paranoid. The kind of folks who would notice 3 broken twigs in a line and go, that's either a big animal or Carl's been pretending he's a lion again. Either way, time to quietly walk in the other direction. Meanwhile, decision-making had to happen fast and often against a cacophony of growling wolves, crackling campfires, and toddler-sized insects. One misstep and, oops, you're a fossil. And this didn't just apply to avoiding predators. Choosing what to eat was a whole course in trial and error. Hey, Unga ate those red berries last week, and now she thinks she's a fire god and sleeps in the river. Let's maybe not serve those at dinner. Slowly, through generations of culinary roulette, humans built up what we now call taste, or at the very least, not dying from lunch. And let us not forget fire. Magical, mesmerizing, burny fire. The original centerpiece of our species' Instagram aesthetic. But it didn't just show up one day in someone's inbox. It was discovered, most likely, by someone poking a lightning-struck bush and realizing, hey, this smells like roasted chicken, and I don't know what a chicken is yet. But taming fire wasn't just about warmth and waffles. It was a social revolution. Suddenly, evenings weren't just a mad dash to your cave, followed by 6 hours of heartbeat monitoring every twig snap. You could sit, breathe, and, not to get sentimental, tell stories. And not just survival tips or Unga fell into the river again stories, but legends. Memory became myth, and myth became identity. Of course, fire also required decisions. Keep it going. Where should it be placed? Who watches it overnight? These choices, small as they seemed, defined group roles, trust systems, and whether or not Gronk had eyebrows in the morning. And slowly, the people who made the better decisions, usually the ones that didn't involve juggling embers or daring the hyenas to a dance-off, became leaders, not kings, not yet, but respected. The people you let decide what berries to bring to the potluck. And in this quiet revolution of cautious choices, something else began to take root: cooperation. A particularly strange and miraculous idea, especially if you've ever driven through rush hour traffic in the modern era. Here were groups of individuals who, despite jealousy, ambition, and the eternal human love of being right, managed to figure out how to live together. Not perfectly, not even politely, but well enough to stay alive. So how did these quiet daily decisions shape who we are now? They standardized something our modern minds still use constantly. The ability to weigh consequences. Is that meeting necessary? Is that email urgent? Should I engage in hand-to-hand combat over the last parking spot? Somewhere deep in your brain, a small ancestral voice whispers, perhaps not worth the mauling. And so, as fire crackled and stars wheeled above the thatched darkness of humanity's early camps, we began to ask more than, what's for dinner? We asked, what happens if I do this? And more importantly, what happens if I don't? A quiet miracle, really. One burrowed deep into our DNA. All thanks to generations who knew instinctively that survival was not just about bravado, but about the kind of wisdom that sleeps quietly in small, thoughtful choices. Let's drift gently into that ember-lit hush now, where decisions had real weight, yet left no pressure behind. Tomorrow, we'll stir the coals again and examine what happened when humans broke the oldest rule of survival, staying put. We begin, rather unexpectedly, with a potato. Not a noble food, by any stretch. It has neither the aristocratic poise of wine nor the historic heft of bread. The potato is humble, lumpy, and beige, like that aunt who knits questionable sweaters and always asks if you've eaten enough. But quietly, without making much fuss, the potato may have saved millions of lives and possibly changed the very blueprint of European survival. Our story tonight takes us to the misty highlands of the Andes, long before Europeans even knew which direction west was. Indigenous peoples there, the true tinkerers of tubers, cultivated thousands of varieties of potatoes, small purple ones, yellow speckled ones, potatoes that looked like they were designed on an ancient Etch-A sketch. These early Peruvians knew how to store them by freeze-drying the spuds into something called chuño, which sounds adorable but tastes like a potato that's been through an existential crisis. Eventually, through a series of conquests, shipwrecks, and very confused explorers with itchy beards, the potato made its grubby little voyage to Europe in the 16th century. At first, people were suspicious. It grew underground. It had a way of sprouting unsettling alien tentacles if forgotten in the pantry. And, worst of all, it wasn't mentioned in the Bible, which may have ranked higher on the don't trust it list than the sprouting tentacles. But here's where history gently tips its reading glasses and says, just wait. Because bit by bit, peasants, those fantastic practical problem solvers, started planting potatoes anyway. What they found was nothing short of miraculous. Potatoes yielded far more food per acre than grains and could survive in miserable soils that would make wheat collapse in tears. 1 hectare of potato crops could feed not just a family, but a small village, assuming the villagers weren't too picky and had a thing for mashing stuff. The potato became a sneaky champion, quietly upping the caloric intake of rural Europe, helping populations grow faster, stronger, and slightly gassier. By the mid-18th century, Prussia's King Frederick the Great got so fond of potatoes that he ordered his people to plant them. Unfortunately, they refused, preferring to stick with traditional grains and a healthy distrust of vegetables that refused to explain themselves. So the cunning king came up with a plan. He planted royal potato fields and surrounded them with guards, forbidding commoners from stealing the royal crops. Naturally, peasants saw this unusual level of security and assumed the potatoes must be valuable, possibly magical. And sure enough, they began sneaking in to steal and replant them at home. A perfect crime where everyone got full. In its earthy, nobbled silence, the potato offered something extraordinary: insurance. A single frost could parch a wheat field, rains could ruin oats, but potatoes, with their underground hide-and-seek routine, often endured. In times of famine, they were the last line of defense. Of course, like any hero, the potato had its downfall. Over-reliance on just a few varieties led to the Great Irish Famine in the 1840s, when a vicious fungus decided to crash the party. Millions starved or fled, reminding humanity quite sternly of the perils of putting all your potatoes in one basket. Still, for centuries, the humble tuber had done its job, feeding the working classes, fueling revolutions, and sneaking into the hearts of dinner plates worldwide. An uncelebrated champion of caloric efficiency, beige but brave. In the grand theatre of history, where generals prance and kings monologue, the potato simply dug in and grew, and in doing so, it helped humans not only survive but shape economies, defeat famines, and ruin countless low-carb diets centuries before they were invented. As we ease into a quieter corner of history's living room, where the fire crackles with the contentment of small discoveries, let us leave our little spud to rest underground for now. Ahead lies another peculiar decision, this one involving a Roman public restroom, communal sponges, and the very early battle for personal hygiene. But that's a story for another soft moment, once you've tilted your head on the pillow just so. In a drizzly hamlet somewhere in what is now modern-day Belgium, several thousand years ago, a group of Neolithic villagers stared at something strange, something new, and something that, if you're being honest, nobody quite trusted yet: a turnip. Let's be fair, the turnip is not the superstar of human history. It lacks the drama of the potato, the romance of the tomato, and the charisma of wheat. But that humble root, lumpy and flavorfully melancholic, marks the beginning of one of humanity's most powerful survival instincts, eating things that really shouldn't have looked appetizing at the time. You see, survival isn't just about invention, it's about indecision too. About someone squinting at a bitter ball of starch sticking out of the ground and declaring, "Yes, this is dinner," and then not dying. That choice, probably made while half a tribe watched from behind a rock, was part daring bravery, part starvation-fueled optimism, and it helped set off a chain of agricultural triumphs that would define entire civilizations. All because one brave soul, cheeks hollow and mood slightly wilted, decided to see if boiling it for 6 hours might help. But it wasn't just about root vegetables. The entire agricultural revolution, one of humanity's great plot twists, was full of deeply questionable decisions that somehow worked out. Take goats, for example. Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, a clever cluster of humans looked at a wild goat, horns, anger, issues, general defiance of fences, and said, "We should keep them." A sentence that has caused approximately 8,000 years of minor chaos. Goat taming, as it turns out, was a bold move. These creatures were escape artists, loud eaters, and wildly uninterested in behaving. But they gave milk, sort of, sometimes, if you could catch them, soothe them, and remain on speaking terms. So naturally, humans persisted. The idea was simple. Rather than chasing animals all over the hills, why not let them live nearby? What seemed like genius innovation probably looked more like a barnyard sitcom at first. Goats doing parkour over garden walls, chickens committing small acts of rebellion, pigs mysteriously vanishing and then reappearing somewhere far less convenient. Yet somehow, this chaotic menagerie became the backbone of stable food supplies. Human survival got less scrambly. Meanwhile, people were planting things, not just turnips, barley, lentils, peas, hundreds of plants that once grew wild and now, perhaps begrudgingly, grew where we told them to. Sort of. With enough yelling and weather-related disappointment. The shift to farming wasn't just about growing more food. It was about having food tomorrow and the next day. It meant settlements, shared labor, and thousands of thankless decisions involving compost experiments and early hoe design. Yes, someone, somewhere, had to be the first person to spend weeks hitting the soil with a stick before figuring out how to attach a smooth stone to it and call it a hoe. Innovation, as always, is simply irritated repetition. With grain came bread. With bread came happiness. With happiness came arguments about how long to bake it. And from those small disagreements, the foundations of civilization were kneaded into something sort of edible, and crucially, not poison. The Neolithic Age also brought that most miraculous concept, stored food, a revelation so powerful that it allowed humans to dream beyond the daily scavenge. And what did they store that food in? Pots. This can't be overstated. Pottery changed the game. Before pottery, your leftover lentils had to be, well, eaten immediately or given to a goat. But now, you could stash them in beautifully awkward clay vessels that cracked just a little too easily, but gave you the illusion of control. And so, on quiet evenings by the fire, as goats bleated softly and someone wondered aloud whether fermenting barley on purpose might be fun, human history marched gently forward. It was in these moments, small choices made before bedtime, slow decisions scratched into damp earth, the hopeful planting of a few more peas, that humanity secured its place. And just as the moon rose over those early rooftops of woven reed and wild imagination, another question began to take shape. What do you do when you have more food than you can eat, and your neighbor doesn't? Now we step into the deliciously tricky business of sharing, or more specifically, not sharing. In the low, flickering glow of a cooking fire nearly extinguished, imagine a group of hunter-gatherers sitting in a circle, passing around the world's first regrettable dinner decision. It was a root, possibly toxic, possibly not, but it definitely looked suspicious. Covered in a flaky skin, oozing something disturbingly gelatinous, and doing absolutely nothing fun like sizzling or crisping. Yet, someone leaned in, took a sniff, and said the ancient equivalent of, "Hey, what's the worst that could happen?" And so began the grand tale of human survival through trial, error, and indigestion. The development of cuisine, as it turns out, was less about flavor and more about not dying. And it was mostly held together by the bold hearts of those who looked at a weird plant, a disgruntled mollusk, or the inside of a cow and thought, yes, this goes in the mouth. Long before recipe books and celebrity chefs, prehistoric cooking was based on equal parts hunger, curiosity, and the inability to Google, is this berry fatal? Those berries, though, oh, how humanity gambled with berries. Some were sweet, some were bitter. Some were sweet, then bitter, then unconscious. The only way to find out was, of course, the old chew and pray test. There was likely a robust oral tradition around who in the tribe had tried which berry and for how long they had either flourished or foamed at the mouth afterward. Eventually, patterns emerged. Foods began to be pre-selected, not just for lack of toxicity, but for how well they paired with other foods we'd also survived. Humans, surprisingly early in their edible experiments, started combining ingredients not just to stay alive, but to make staying alive worth chewing. We discovered through sheer repetition that things mixed together could be better than things inhaled individually in the dark. Now, around the 6th meeting of traditional early morning indigestion, someone possibly very tired of emergency evacuations stumbled upon the miracle of fire, and then the miracle of not just burning food, but cooking it. This, dear dreamer, was revolutionary. Fire meant warmth and light, yes, but to the stomachs of early humans, it meant redemption. Plants that were once eye-wateringly bitter became mellow. Meat went from chewy sadness to smoky invitation. Turtle soup became less of a dare and more of a delicacy. And thus, the communal meal was born. Somewhere in the wilderness, a group of humans passed around a hunk of something vaguely edible that had been expertly not burnt, and instead of screaming or hacking, someone looked up and smiled that rare Stone Age smile that didn't mean, "I have just seen a saber-toothed cat." It meant, "Is there more of this?" And oh, there was. With cooking came the mysterious transformation of the mundane. Onions went sweet. Grains turned to porridge. Bones gave up their marrowy secrets to broth. Even the fishiest fish started getting wrapped in leaves and steamed, suddenly becoming gourmet, or at least edible without tears. No longer were meals simply fuel. They became social contracts. Shared flavors gave birth to shared stories. Traditions began to form, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter in murmured instructions like, "Never eat that mushroom again," or "Add more salt next time." That stew was sad. Over time, tastes evolved, sharpened by trade and tempered by time. With salt came preservation, with oil frying, with clay pots boiling, and with the slow, patient simmering of whatever is in that cauldron, humanity began to sit a bit longer next to the fire, to tell tales with full mouths and warmer hearts. Somewhere around the invention of bread, a marvel involving hours of waiting, water, and the happy accident of yeast, the meal took its final form as ritual, a baked, crackling piece of safety, proof, pun absolutely intended, that against all odds and indigestion, humans had decided not only to eat, but to wait for something delicious. So tonight, as you drift further into your blanket cocoon that smells faintly of lavender and maybe very faintly of fabric softener, imagine the first human who accidentally invented soup. They had a pot, they had some water, they had a spare bone and maybe a turnip, and they had no idea that they had just made history, softly bubbling away. The next fork on the road in human survival wasn't one of cuisine, but of something slipperier, a concept we now take for granted, but at the time was baffling, smelly, and involved a great deal of arguing over whose turn it was. A hint, it glistens and occasionally gets stuck in your eye, but will float there gently, together. In the drowsy cradle of pre-industrial kitchens, beneath thatched roofs, and amidst the patient bubbling of dubious stews, one small decision quietly swept across humanity like a sleepy wave. To cook or not to cook? That was the question. At least, it was once we stopped gnawing on raw tubers and dodging saber-toothed disapproval. Somewhere around 1.8 million years ago, give or take a few snoozes, Homo erectus stumbled upon what we might affectionately call culinary innovation, though we'd have to wait another millennium to invent the apron. Archaeologists posit that our bipedal ancestors made fire not just their source of warmth and predator insurance, but also an experimental kitchen appliance. And what followed was the original slow cooker diet, because nothing says gourmet like meat so tender its original species is unrecognizable. Cooking did more than just make dinner slightly less crunchy. It softened roots, detoxified seeds, and released calories otherwise imprisoned in raw fibers. The human digestive system, once a fearsome internal jungle gym, began shrinking, less intestine, more brain. Yes, our guts downsized, and our brains bulked up, perhaps in anticipation of complex activities like gossiping and inventing specialized cheeses. Imagine some early Homo erectus, let's name her Onga, standing beside a fire, holding a stick with something suspiciously foot-shaped roasting on the end. Someone behind her, probably Ugg, chews raw bird and frowns. Fire makes weird. Ugg grunts. Onga grins, takes a slow bite, and mutters, "Yes, but soft. No choke." By the time Homo sapiens joined the party, this casual culinary revolution had baked itself into our DNA. Civilization doesn't begin with the wheel, or with cuneiform, or even wine, though that last one certainly helped. Civilization stumbled into being when someone chose to put a yam in a pot instead of their pockets. Because when we started cooking, we had to sit. And when we sat, we had to talk, trade trinkets, and argue about spices. You cannot roast mammoth if you're running every 10 minutes. Cooking required calm, and calm allowed culture. Later farmers cultivated wheat not for its charm, but its a basic willingness to become bread. Early bread making was, honestly, a bit tragic. Flat, hard, and able to dent iron. But if you dipped it in enough goat milk, called it a meal, and rearranged responsibility for baking to someone else, it worked. The domestication of fire also gave us entirely new reasons to build our homes around centralized hearths, invent spoons, and write passive-aggressive recipes. Some of the earliest cookbooks read more like grim survival instructions. Clean the frog, place in pot, hope. Still, inventiveness simmered along. In ancient Mesopotamia, scribes recorded recipes for meat pies, marked with faint hints of culinary pride. Akkadian lamb stew, do not substitute donkey. These tiny decisions to add leeks instead of onions, to roast instead of boil, nudged us toward identity, regional flavor, and occasionally food poisoning. And then came salt, that quiet conqueror of tongues. Early humans realized that salt not only made things taste less, like bark, but it also preserved meat. With salted surplus, you could eat in January what you hunted in July, assuming mice didn't get there first. Like fire, salt required balance and caution. Too little, and your dried fish weeps itself back into oblivion. Too much, and you've basically mummified dinner. Every simple kitchen act began to build cultures. Fermentation, for example, was once a confusing accident. Someone left berries in the sun, drank the juice, and suddenly felt confident enough to invent tribal leadership. Cheese, too, was and remains controlled spoilage. Early Europe endured years of trial and error to perfect mystery molds, guided by little more than bravery and a lack of modern refrigeration. Even the humble spoon, forged initially from bone or carved wood, shaped how we consumed. Fingers were fine, but soups demanded courtesy. And as meals grew more complex, so did table manners. Suddenly, it mattered how you chewed, where you sat, and what sauce touched what loaf. From campfire to banquet, the way we prepared and shared food evolved into a map of who we were, one bite at a time. So yes, the next time you stir your tea or warm your leftovers, just remember, early humans decided to soften their roots and survived because of it. Their descendants came up with ramen. And somewhere not very far from here, some sleepy ancestor roasted the world's first marshmallow equivalent, gazed up at the stars, belly full, and thought, what if we ate this every Tuesday? Now, as the ember light flickers low and smoke curls like a forgotten recipe, Our quiet tale drifts from kitchens to doorways, from fire pits to fences, and the curious choice to stay rather than to wander. In the quiet folds of ancient kitchens, or as they were then called, places where things were burned and occasionally eaten, an unassuming revolution was gently simmering. It did not wear armor, carry flags, or issue declarations. It wore aprons, smelled like onions, and occasionally started small fires. This, dear listener, was the age when humanity first decided that raw was a suggestion, not a dinner plan. Cooking, a truly transformative human decision, cloaked in the smoky haze of 1,000 campfires. It didn't arrive with fanfare. No caveman threw down his mammoth steak and declared, "From henceforth, it shall be medium rare." No, it likely began with an accident. Perhaps a bolt of lightning roasted an unsuspecting hare, or a mildly clumsy ancestor dropped a fish into a fire and, upon retrieving it, thought, "Well, that's unexpected, but not altogether terrible." What a revelation it must have been to realize that food, when heated, turned not only safer, but softer, tastier, and less likely to chew back. The earliest roots of human cuisine were simple. Grains were smashed into paste, berries were mushed into purple regret, and meat, when available, was grilled to prehistoric perfection. Over time, this humble chore blossomed into an evolutionary power move. Cooked food meant more calories with less chewing, important when your molars were expected to double as nutcrackers and scissors. And so, with bellies full and jaw muscles no longer overworked, the human brain was gifted extra energy. The result? A blossoming of thought, language, and possibly complaints about seasoning. Just imagine the first argument over whether mammoth rump pairs better with crushed pine needles or wild garlic. The birth of culinary critique, circa a long, long time ago. But cooking, you see, was more than nutrition. It was the hearth, the glowing center of every early community. Firelight flickering against cave walls, shadows dancing like prehistoric pantomimes, stories being told in grunts and gestures as tasty morsels passed from hand to hand. It was how trust was built. You didn't share fire with just anyone. You shared it with your own. And once someone gave you their last charred root, vegetable, well, you were practically family. Fast forward several thousand roasted boars and boiled bugs, and cooking continued to shape not only survival, but society itself. In Egypt, bread became both sustenance and currency. A pharaoh could probably pay for pyramid labor in loaves, though poorly risen ones likely resulted in angry stonemasons. In Greece, feasts spilled into philosophy. Picture Plato, one hand gesturing toward truth, the other reaching for hummus. And in Rome, the endlessly theatrical Rome, cooking evolved into performance. They adored oddities, flamingo tongues, absolutely. Dormice stuffed with herbs and nuts. Popular hors d'oeuvres, no judgment, except maybe a tiny bit. But to them, cuisine demonstrated power. If you could afford a peacock roasted in its own feathers, why wouldn't you? Though it must be said, practicality wasn't always invited to these banquets. Meanwhile, those not reclining on silken couches also cooked, albeit with fewer exotic birds. Communal ovens in medieval towns baked bread for entire neighborhoods, each family marking their loaf with a symbol to identify it later, something between baking and bingo. Villagers shared not only heat, but gossip, laughter, and the occasional recipe disaster. Even in times of scarcity or isolation, cooking endured. Out at sea, salted cod kept sailors bleakly nourished while they dreamed of anything other than more cod. And on the snowy steppes of Central Asia, Nomadic fires cooked hearty meals with whatever the wind hadn't blown away. In every clime, kitchen fires flickered on. There's a strange comfort in that continuity. Cooking turned out to be far more than a biological shortcut. It was a culture-forging, community-building, argument-starting act of practical alchemy. From the earliest skewers of char to the meticulously layered meals of monarchs, it tethered us to each other with invisible ribbons of scent and smoke. And now, as the last embers of our fire grow dim and that sweet, smoky scent lingers in the air, we roll gently onward, toward a different kind of decision. Imagine a world where sleep was invented for survival, but evolved into something far more curious. A place where dreams weren't distractions, but blueprints for belief. The moon rises, the pot is empty, but the story stirs on. It's a curious thing, really, how much humanity has done simply to avoid being cold, wet, or slightly uncomfortable. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen. Technological revolutions have been launched and treaties signed because someone somewhere got a very chilly draft down the back of their tunic and said, "Right, that's enough of that." Tonight, under the soft hush of imagined campfires and the rustling thoughts of our ancestors, we turn to one of the most undervalued survival tools in all of human history: the humble domestic decision. Not the grand strategies of emperors or the legendary voyages across oceans, no, but the quieter choices. What to eat, what to wear, when to get up in the morning, and crucially, when to stay in bed and let the saber-toothed tiger pass on by. Take, for instance, the ancient practice of storing food. Not exactly riveting stuff, until you consider that the simple act of drying, salting, or burying a piece of mammoth meat in snow might have given early humans just enough edge to outlive those who didn't. Some poor Neanderthal, perhaps, who decided that leftovers were for quitters and instead scoffed the whole leg at once. Noble appetite, short-lived dynasty. Around 10,000 years ago, our ancestors began experimenting with agriculture, not necessarily because they had a grand love for wheat, but because chasing an antelope for 6 hours only to miss every javelin throw kind of loses its charm. So they settled down, grew grain, and promptly invented porridge, which, while not known for its razzle-dazzle, is what happens when you mix survival, patience, and rainwater left in a clay bowl. It's hard to dramatize porridge. Hollywood has never tried, but it fed families that would later build cities, argue about philosophy, and wear increasingly unnecessary hats. And all of that began with someone deciding, I bet these weird little grass seeds would taste better with some boiling. Fast forward to medieval Europe, where survival still very much depended on domestic choices, particularly what went into your pottage. If you were lucky, it was cabbage, leeks, and beans. If you were less so, it was cabbage, leeks, beans, and an adventurous frog. Kitchens were smoky, dinners repetitive, and every so often a whole household survived the winter because Grandma knew exactly when to pull up the turnips. It wasn't just food that kept people alive, though. Oh no. There was also the critical matter of clothing. Before technical fabrics, puffer jackets, and the heated socks you can buy online at 2 a.m. when you're feeling emotionally vulnerable, humans wore mostly what animals didn't need anymore. In colder regions, a well-wrapped blanket of fur meant warmth, health, and just enough style to impress the community. Somewhere in prehistoric Scandinavia, a man probably strutted around in reindeer hide like it was Milan Fashion Week, while his neighbors whispered, "Bjorn really thinks he's something since he caught that extra caribou." And yet, As silly as it seems, choosing what to wear wasn't just about comfort. It was battlefield strategy against frostbite, a silent defiance against nature's cold shoulder. The layering choices of an Iron Age farmer could usher a family towards spring, or not, and a poorly timed exposure to the elements could render one thoroughly mythologized in the family saga. Here lies Uncle Rolfer, who mocked hats. Even sleeping arrangements demanded tactical precision. Ancient beds, if they existed, were often boxes filled with straw, sometimes moss, and in one documented 14th century monastery, disappointingly full of mice who paid no rent. But the decision to sleep off the floor, monumental, less exposure to damp, fewer creepy crawlies, a higher success rate for waking up still alive. In fact, the very idea of bedtime rituals, arranging the fire, setting out tomorrow's bread dough, tucking in close to others for warmth, were decisions written not in ink, but instinct. They were passed from mother to daughter, father to son, cousin to cousin, who really ought to have moved out by now. And within those nightly choices, the ones that seem small, quiet, even dull, you find the actual backbone of human survival. Less heroic than hunting sabers, far less cinematic than war. But it turns out, deciding to wear another layer, save a bit of stew, or sleep on a pile of hay, was a subtle act of rebellion, a gentle way to keep going. And now, as the fire crackles low, and the moths of memory begin their flutter through time, we drift slowly toward another quiet decision, one involving spindles, shawls, and the gentle art of weaving survival, one thread at a time. In the cool hush of an ancient Scandinavian forest, long before furniture became something people argued about in IKEA, a hunter named Eric made a decision that would, quite unintentionally, nudge the human race one step closer to not freezing to death every winter. He didn't know it at the time, but Eric was about to invent layering. You see, Eric had a problem. The tundra was crisp and poetic in the mornings, but by midday, it transformed into a surprisingly sweaty ordeal for someone chasing reindeer with a sharpened stick. His fellow villagers opted for the traditional method of dressing like a bear and hoping for the best. Eric, however, began to experiment, adding and subtracting layers throughout his day like an overly dramatic onion. His innovation, a tunic made of wool, a squirrel pelt vest, and a loosely woven shawl he could toss over his shoulder with the flair of a fashion-forward druid. Functional, yes, but he also looked fantastic. Villagers noticed. "Eirik," they said, "why are you not shivering until your soul leaves your body?" Eric shrugged. "I just took one thing off, then put it back on." And thus, the cold weather concept of layers became woven, not just onto his limbs, but into the fabric of early human survival. It's often the smallest decision, wrapped in a bit of wool and a touch of curiosity, that becomes the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Another such decision was made not in the frostbitten north, but in the blistering chaos of a Mesopotamian kitchen. If we can call a three-legged fire pit and a frantic goat a kitchen. There, a woman named Tamaz worked beside bubbling clay pots, trying to keep lentils from jumping out and attacking the bread. One day, she noticed that if she left water in a clay jar overnight near the ashes, it tasted different, sharper. It held a soft bite that was somehow invigorating. Even to her goat, who began showing signs of mild jazz dancing after sipping it by accident. What Tamaz had unwittingly created was the earliest form of fermentation. Fermentation, of course, being the ancient art of accidentally making things go fizzy and deciding to go ahead and drink them anyway. Long before microscopes and lab coats, survival sometimes meant taking a hilarious risk, which, granted, occasionally resulted in excruciating consequences, but also beer. So really, who's to judge? Of course, these experimental minds didn't know the chemistry. They didn't sit under the stars theorizing about lactobacilli. They just followed instincts and perhaps mild boredom. They had the delightful gall to try things, molding bits of plant here, forgetting bread in pockets there. Small, snack-sized decisions that turned into entire culinary legacies. Jump ahead again, this time along the winding coastlines of ancient China, where salt traders scurried their goods across the country like slow, dusty squirrels. Someone, we'll call her Lin, grew tired of lugging soggy fish around in the southern heat. Clever Lin decided to stuff the fish into a clay pot with an ungodly amount of salt. Whether out of preservation hopes or pure spite, we may never know, but the outcome was glorious. Fish sauce. Yes, that pungent, shimmering liquid, now the soul of savory dishes across continents, began as someone's lazy attempt to keep lunch from melting. And it worked. Fish sauce struck a chord in human taste buds that lit up the brain's pleasure centers like a ceremonial bonfire. It's salty, it's funky, and, if you're honest with yourself, it's basically bottled evolution. These modest choices, peel off that pelt, taste the bubbly puddle, stuff the fish in salt and pray, weren't guided by scientific method or divine revelation. They were born of nudges, comfort-seeking, curiosity, or perhaps an urgent need to not die of boredom while stirring lentils. Even footwear, dear listener, traces its origins to a simple moment of grit, or rather, avoiding it. Along the dunes of ancient Egypt, a weary traveler named Hanenu decided sand in the toes ranked below acceptable levels of happiness. He fashioned a set of reed-woven soles and tied them to his feet with twine. The starting point of sandals, ancient anti-annoyance devices that let humans stride through harsher terrains just a little more smugly. Across ages and empires, everyday tweaks and tiny revelations slowly stitched together the tapestry of thriving. The line between enduring and perishing was never drawn in grand declarations or golden scrolls. It was in the shrug of a woolen cloak, the sniff of spoiled fish that somehow smelled promising, or the click of a reed against a heel. And as twilight settles on these tales of intuitive brilliance, we tiptoe toward another quietly magnificent turning point, an idea sparked not by the cold or hunger or even thirst, but by a stubborn human need to explain the stars without climbing them. In a humble medieval cottage, nestled somewhere between the invention of turnips and the disappointment of boiled cabbage, a villager once had an idea. Not a great idea, mind you. Just a very average sort of idea. The kind of idea you get while stirring porridge or watching a sheep stare into the void. That idea. Let's put a door on the house. Now, to you and I, this may not seem like a revelation. Doors abound. They're everywhere, keeping cold out, cats in, and neighbors at bay. But back in the days when insulation was a generous pile of straw, and the wind had free rein over domestic affairs, the simple addition of a door was, dare I say, survival chic. The door revolution didn't happen overnight. At first, openings in homes were nothing more than polite suggestions for entry. Flaps of cloth, cleverly stacked stones with ambition. Or, for the wealthier sort, an ancient blanket that once belonged to a noble goat. But then someone thought, what if this opening closed? Cue the humble wooden plank, rough, creaking, and just wide enough to keep out a hungry wolf with commitment issues. But what these early doors lacked in elegance, they made up for in pest deterrence and neighborly excuse. "Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you calling from the field. I had the door closed." Doors quietly altered human survival. With a bit more control over who or what came in, humans could sleep longer and panic less frequently. Rest, of course, is something evolution values almost as much as opposable thumbs or the ability to digest cheese beyond childhood. Safe sleep meant clearer thinking, better decision-making, and fewer midnight wolf jousts. But doors had another unintended consequence: privacy. Suddenly, interior spaces had boundaries. You couldn't just walk into someone's hovel and comment on their mead, storage, without permission. This tiny shift in architectural thinking planted the earliest seeds of individualism, which is a fancy way of saying someone, somewhere, finally got to say, "No entry without knocking." As doors evolved, so too did the idea that homes could offer more than just shelter. They could be sanctuaries, personal hubs, places where one could hoard breadcrumbs in peace. And with doors came locks, and with locks came keys, and with keys came the first recorded instance of someone losing a key and blaming the dog. Elsewhere in history, the door became not just function, but symbol. In ancient Rome, crossing the threshold of a home required reverence. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and endings, was the patron deity of doorways. Imagine being so important to an archway that someone builds a temple in your honor. In a way, the Romans were the first to say, "Don't underestimate a good doorway. It's where all the drama starts." Meanwhile, in colder climes, doors did more than mark boundaries. They trapped heat, kept in warmth, tricked skeptical in-laws into thinking someone had spent hours preparing a stew, when in truth, it was just the smell of damp firewood and regret. One curious thing about doors: the better they got, the more suspicious humans became. By the 17th century, the art of knocking had reached diplomatic levels. Too soft, and no one answered. Too loud, and it was either the sheriff or a debt collector. Enter the door knocker, an object designed to make noise on behalf of the anxious hand. And should you think only homes were affected, consider the tavern door. Its timely creak signaled the arrival of gossip, long-winded tales, and someone very confused by the price of beer. The door became the foil in countless stories, slamming in anger, opening in hope, or quietly left ajar by someone with a secret and poor hinge awareness. So there we are, the mundane glory of the door, not the most glamorous invention perhaps. It won't win awards or trend on artisan scrolls. But this humble slice of wood or stone gave humans the gift of choosing what to let in and what to keep out, be it wolves, weather, or that overly social neighbor with radical sauna theories. And so, as we leave our wooden sentinel behind for the evening, let's follow the path that led indoors to places even more curious, where water ran uphill, well, sort of, and pipes carried more than just liquid. In the quiet hush of a medieval kitchen, one surviving chicken clucking somewhere off stage, we find human survival tiptoeing forward with the most unexpected of heroes: seasoning. Yes, before the spice trade sent fleets across oceans and filled treasure chests with cinnamon where gold should be, the humble salt crystal was already performing miracles: preservation, flavor, and just a hint of passive aggression. Because passing someone the salt was once a deeply honorable gesture, unless you slid it across the table, which could imply you questioned their worth as both guest and sentient being. Centuries before refrigeration, salt was life. Quite literally. Without it, meat would rot, fish would fade away into fishy despair, and winter's pantry would laugh in your frostbitten face. So humanity, clever even when cold and underfed, learned to dry, pickle, and salt things like their existence depended on it, which, incredibly, it did. In ancient Rome, soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, a salarium, the distant ancestor of the modern word salary. Imagine marching into battle hoping for a raise and being handed an exceptionally fine pile of sodium. But in fairness, that crystalline pay had purchasing power. It flavored your porridge, cured your ham, and turned you into a glowing beacon of culinary stability in an unpredictable empire. Meanwhile, pepper was having its glow up far away in India and Southeast Asia. Quietly waiting for humanity to become obsessive, traders risked pirates and monsoons to transport it. In Europe, a pinch of black pepper could fetch the equivalent of a day's wage. The spice rack of a well-off medieval merchant looked less like kitchenware and more like a geological exhibit at the Museum of Things Expensive. But before spices were traded, hoarded, or poeticized, they were discovered by accident. Some daring prehistoric soul must have leaned too far over a fire, dropped a herb into the stew, and, after checking for divine displeasure, found the result surprisingly not revolting. This, presumably, became the first recipe. Step 1. Forage irresponsibly. Step 2. Drop something green into broth. Step 3. Invent cooking. This long culinary courtship led humankind to make daily decisions that subtly ensured their survival. Like, for instance, adding a sour plant to milk and marveling at the curdled result, rather than screaming and burning it. Cheese was not only born, but passed down like a family legend with a slightly offensive smell. Then there's garlic, humanity's oldest contradiction, simultaneously sacred and stinky. Ancient Egyptians fed it to workers building the pyramids, believing it gave strength and warded off diseases. It's hard not to picture a foreman shouting motivationally over a cloud of breath only a vampire could fear. Flavor became function. Herbs in stews didn't just taste lovely. They killed bacteria and tricked your brain into feeling well-rested and royal. And while modern chefs chase Michelin stars, their Neolithic ancestors were just trying to not get food poisoning on a Thursday. Even boiling water was a decision that nudged humanity forward. Boiled soups and teas emerged not just from a love of warmth, but from a cautious relationship with dysentery. A bubbling cauldron was less about witchcraft and more about not dying young and mysteriously. The witch hat came later, mostly for fashion. Communities that stumbled upon these good choices, boiling water, salting meat, flavoring rice with turmeric, lived longer and continued to produce people who preferred not to expire before inventing things, like paper clips or democracy. In South America, the elegant culinary mystery of maize took root, but corn, dear sleepy listener, was not born buttery and cheerful. It had to be nixtamalized, soaked in an alkaline solution to release key nutrients. This process was an act of scientific finesse, long before so many scientists had bureaus. Societies that skipped this step often suffered from pellagra, a rather rude disease that sounds like a tropical cocktail, but is absolutely not. And yet, we made decisions, these tiny daily choices about what to eat, how to heat it, and what to sprinkle on top. Some choices, like mixing sweet with savory or inserting raisins where they don't belong, are still hotly debated. But most of our ancestors got the survival recipes just right, even if acid reflux wasn't yet properly named. So as evening, simmers low and your thoughts float gently toward dreams. Remember, those seemingly boring dishes of yesterday, those stews, pickles, and gritty loaves, weren't just dinner. They were carefully plated strategies ensuring that someone, somewhere, would have the strength to build a bridge, write a scroll, or possibly invent the concept of napping. And speaking of napping, the next soft turn in our story brings us to a place where architecture, rather accidentally, became a shield against extinction. There is something wonderfully quaint about shoes. Not the spiky, pain-inducing ones that modern fashion insists we wobble in, but the clompety, creaky, profoundly practical footwear of our long-gone ancestors. Because, dear listener, long before Nike Air soles and orthopedic inserts, there was a time when choosing what to wear on your feet meant the difference between survival and sockless doom. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Socks hadn't been invented yet. Let us travel back, gently now, to a quieter age. The year is somewhere between why are we still alive and hey, agriculture is going all right. Primitive humans, still mastering the delicate art of not stepping on sharp objects, began to fashion what we now lovingly refer to as foot coverings. Not for style, though surely someone attempted flair with extra mammoth hide, but for protection, warmth, and perhaps to avoid stepping on one too many porcupines. The earliest known shoes, soft moccasin-like things, emerged around 8,000 years ago. Discovered in a cave in Oregon, the Fort Rock sandals were crafted out of woven sagebrush bark. I'd like you to imagine a devoted early human hunched in candleless gloom, meticulously threading bark strips together by firelight, all to avoid yet another encounter with a particularly pointy bit of shale. That, my friend, is dedication to comfort, or at the very least, an early response to plantar fasciitis. But here's the cozy twist. These floppy foot mittens weren't just about pampering. They actually nudged our survival in a subtle, enduring way. As climates cooled and early humans migrated into icy Europe and bone-chilling Asia, the ability to insulate one's feet became essential. Naked toes on permafrost. That's a recipe for extinction. And no one wants to go down in history as the species that tripped over a glacier due to cold feet. In fact, anthropologists noticed something curious. Over time, the toes of skeletal remains from colder regions became daintier, less robust, less spread out, more shoe-wearing. Because when you don't grip with your toes like evolution intended, thank you shoes, they begin to lose their ape-like splay. And so, the humble foot covering not only shaped our survival, but quietly remodeled our anatomy. Feet, the unsung canvas of progress. Now, as civilizations grew and egos inflated, shoes evolved from necessity to accessory. The Romans, ever the overachievers, created sandals with impeccable road mileage. Leather, adjustable straps, occasionally some nail-studded soles, for grip, not combat. And off they marched, thousands of miles, conquering in style. The average Roman soldier's sandal could handle more terrain than your cousin's underused gym membership. And they had the calf muscles to prove it. Then there were the medieval Europeans, who decided practicality was simply too practical, and instead created shoes with absurdly long pointy toes called poulaines. Some extended several inches beyond the actual foot, flopping about like melancholy teacup handles. The nobler your status, the longer your toe. A literal step forward in class warfare. Sadly, these were rather hazardous during fire emergencies and extremely inconvenient when trying to sneak up on someone. But for survival, even the slipperiest fashion has its reasons. Shoes often indicated status trade and mobility. In ancient China, the development of sturdy, cloth footwear contributed to marchable soldiers and marchable rice farmers. In Africa, sandals made of braided fibers adapted to hot, open terrain. And in Japan, the wooden gaiter elevated feet from soggy earth and the occasional enthusiastic frog. Every culture devised a way to walk smarter, not harder. And so you see, while the shoe seems trivial sitting by your nightstand, in history it was nothing short of a soft revolution. Each choice, to pioneer a strap, to weave a tighter sole, to stuff straw into the lining before crossing the frozen Alps, nudged us toward longevity, toward migration, toward lives with fewer blisters and more civilization. And tonight, as your feet rest beneath the weightless comfort of your blanket, know that they carry the echoes of sagebrush bark, Roman grit, and medieval flair. They've been through an awful lot, even if these days their biggest battle is escaping the constraints of a tight sock. Now, let us tread lightly forward into an even smaller decision, one that once held shocking consequences for the fabric of society. The seemingly innocent matter of how people chose to cook their food. In the gentle hush of the early 17th century, when maps were still rumors and suspicion came bundled with every foreign fruit, something curiously transformative was happening in the kitchens of Europe. A rather unassuming spud, yes, the humble potato, was quietly plotting its global culinary conquest. And even though it looked like a clump of dirt and had the gastronomic charisma of a rock, it would eventually help feed empires and inspire some unexpectedly passionate arguments about gravy. But let's rewind slightly. You see, for most of human history, people were deeply, almost romantically suspicious of tubers. Quite understandable, really. Lots of underground rooty things can be toxic, explosive, or just smell like betrayal. The potato had its origins in the Andes Mountains, domesticated some 7,000 years ago by indigenous farming communities who clearly knew a good thing when they dug it up. With over 4,000 varieties and more starch than a Victorian gentleman's collar, the potato was resilient, nutritious, and beautifully bland, the holy trinity of survival food. But when the potato first arrived in Europe thanks to Spanish explorers in the 1570s, it was met with all the enthusiasm of a soggy boot. People found it suspicious. It grew underground. It wasn't in the Bible. Monks couldn't classify it. Some claimed it spread leprosy. Others claimed it made people lazy. And entire towns turned their noses up at it, unless it came with a side of witch trial. France, for instance, was deeply anti-potato until a man named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier came along. During the 7 Years' War, he'd been captured by the Prussians and in captivity, fed almost exclusively on potatoes. Imagine that, imprisonment by tuber. But instead of resentment, Parmentier emerged from captivity with something far more unusual: praise for the potato's hearty, nourishing qualities. When he returned to France, he made it his glorious life mission to convince his fellow citizens to fall in love with the potato. He threw lavish potato-only dinner parties for the likes of Benjamin Franklin and royal court members. He planted heavily guarded potato fields on the outskirts of Paris. Guarded to imply value, but loosely enough guarded that curious peasants could sneak in and take some home. Reverse psychology, 18th century style. While France was slowly nibbling potato canapé, other parts of Europe were adapting more quickly, not from culinary enthusiasm, but from agricultural desperation. The late 1700s and early 1800s were full of famine flickers, failed harvests, cold snaps, economic crunches. And the potato's genius was simple. It grew where other crops failed. Rocky soil, uneven rain, little sun. Perfect potato weather, really. If you could grow disappointment in that soil, you could grow potatoes even better. In Ireland, it became the cornerstone of rural survival, with entire families subsisting for generations on milk, potatoes, and a layered blanket system that we might now call preheating yourself for the winter. The Irish grew so dependent on their shapely spud that by the 1840s, an outbreak of potato blight, a fungal horror show that turned healthy plants into soggy sludge, would trigger one of the deadliest famines in European history. But that great tragedy, which changed population patterns across oceans, also began as a set of simple choices. What should we plant? What feeds our families best? What can the soil give? And what can it take away? Quiet decisions made in muddy fields, echoing into movements of migration, cultural reshaping, and teary-eyed arguments about what makes the correct mashed potato. Beyond survival, the potato slipped into identity. Vodka for Russians, pierogi for Poles, samosas for Indians, and the eternal question everywhere else, fries or mash. Imagine, if you will, some distant ancestor, laboring over hard land under a gloomy sky. They fork up a knobbly root, sigh triumphantly, and think, this'll feed the lot, even Uncle Ewan. They wouldn't know they were participating in one of humankind's strangest and sturdiest survival strategies. Dig, cook, eat, repeat. It wasn't dramatic, but it didn't need to be. Resilience rarely is. And so 1,000 tiny choices were made. Over dinner, during planting seasons, in hard winters. All in service of survival, yes, but also comfort. Potatoes, after all, are dreams disguised as starch. Now, as we leave the fields behind and let the last embers of firelight flicker over a well-earned bowl of something warm and steamy, we follow the scent of another survival tale. One that smells faintly of ink, candle wax, and classified mistakes. In the fertile lands of Neolithic Anatolia, roughly 9,000 years ago, long before there were sidewalks to trip on or traffic lights to ignore, a group of early farmers made a decision that would affect all of us, from the sandwich enthusiasts to the sourdough fanatics of today. They chose wheat. Now, to be clear, it wasn't as if a council of proto-hipsters gathered in some linen-wrapped yurt and declared, "Let us henceforth plant only the grass that makes the fluffiest focaccia." It was subtler, more incremental, and, as it turns out, shockingly influential. You see, early humans had choices. They could munch on acorns, graze on barley, or pursue the exceedingly romantic lifestyle of chasing wild boars with pointy sticks. And they did, for millennia. But slowly, quietly, a few began to notice that one particular plant, an awkward little cereal grass named Emma wheat, grew surprisingly predictably in disturbed soil, which, thanks to the helpful habit of human beings standing on and digging up just about anything, was just about everywhere. Emma wheat wasn't glamorous. It had a tight husk that clung stubbornly to the grain like a toddler with separation anxiety. Processing it meant grinding and threshing and essentially inventing the world's first choreography of carbs. But here's the thing. It could be stored. Left alone, it would dry out and sit in clay jars without spoiling. In a world where leftovers usually meant gnawed bones or berries turning into something vaguely fizzy, wheat was astonishingly practical. And so it happened that humans made a quiet sort of pact with their pantry. They began planting more and more wheat, saving seeds, sharing harvests, and, somewhat unintentionally, crafting one of the earliest supply chain systems. Instead of hunting for food, Food now waited in baskets or pit-lined silos. The humans asked little, other than the occasional weeding and a prayer to whoever handled the weather-related department. But with wheat came consequences. First, the calories. A diet filled with grains made survival easier, though slightly starchier. Populations began to balloon like sourdough left too long outside. More people meant bigger settlements, and bigger settlements meant neighbors. Followed swiftly by disputes about goats dumping their personal business on someone else's barley patch. Second, the skeletons. Quite literally. Archaeologists have found that post-agriculture human remains grew shorter and more prone to dental disasters. Turns out nature didn't originally design us for 80% bread. Kindly note, this does not make your croissant unpatriotic, just ancient. And third, bureaucracy. Grain needed to be stored, measured, and kept track of, which soon led to tally marks, clay tokens, and eventually writing. You could argue that a few Neolithic homemakers and their sticky bundles of wheat patiently nudged us toward cuneiform, record keeping, and the magic of asking someone to bring eggs via post-it note. This decision, this gentle shift, also made humans a bit territorial. A field of ripening wheat cannot outrun a rival tribe, nor protest with claws and fangs. It must be guarded. So fences emerged. Tools morphed into weapons. The agricultural revolution didn't simply produce dinner. It produced borders, property, and the awkward question of who owns what. Every time something grew particularly delicious. Yet alongside these hiccups came beauty. Bread became sacred. Literally. In Mesopotamia, they offered it to gods. In Egypt, they baked it in clay ovens shaped like suns. In Rome, they had entire festivals dedicated to wheat, presided over by Ceres, the original goddess of carbs. Today, when you slice through a loaf, you're not just biting into sustenance. You are chewing through centuries of shared decisions, fumbling experiments, and the firm realization that no one ever wanted to live in a land without toast. As twilight gathers around your thoughts and the comforting weight of blankets settle like ancient harvests, consider the gentle stubbornness of those early wheat farmers. They didn't know they were steering humanity toward civilization. They just wanted to stop being hungry. And perhaps that's the most human decision of all. Now let your eyes grow heavy like golden grain at the end of a sun-following stalk, because ahead waits another curious turn, where choices weren't just about planting, but about how we looked at time itself. In the dusky libraries of memory, there's a certain kind of human decision that rarely gets a billboard in history, but may just have saved lives, started empires, and, more importantly, helped people avoid truly terrible sunburns. These are the quiet choices of fabric, fashion, and fidelity to function. Yes, tonight, we venture into the calm and surprisingly consequential world of clothing decisions. Imagine early humans somewhere between inventing the pointed stick and figuring out that fire wasn't just a spicy rock. They're wandering the savannas, noble, hungry, and probably itchy. The first conversations about clothing were likely less about threads per inch and more along the lines of, hey, if we tie this bark to that leaf, it might stop the mosquitoes from devouring Grandpa. Survival, it turns out, had a dress code. There's a curious elegance to this. As humans spread into colder, harsher regions, their bare skin and bravado were no match for the elements. So they began deciding, day by chilly day, which animal hides were coziest, how many furs might constitute too many, and whether it was fashionable or simply practical to wear a mammoth on one's shoulders. Contrary to what caveman cartoons might depict, early clothing was not all loincloths and awkward tunics. There's riveting archaeological evidence, yes, that's a sentence you just heard, that Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens not only dressed warmly, but did so with an eye for craftsmanship. They used awls and needles crafted from bone, stitching together garments with sinew thread. And if that doesn't sound bedtime appropriate, I promise, it was mostly gentle sinew, the comfortable kind. Their choices were deeply intimate acts of quiet engineering. What you wore could mean survival or frostbite, respect or ridicule, warmth or the distinct sensation that your knees had frozen mid-walk. These were not fashion choices in the modern sense. There was no ancient Instagram. Just people, looking at clouds and muttering, might be a two-fur kind of day. Some early Arctic groups, like the Inuit, mastered clothing decisions so completely they practically became wearable thermodynamics. Sewing together caribou skins with careful insulation pockets, they created garments that could withstand unimaginable cold. And let's be clear, they did this centuries before performance fleece or waterproof zippers, all without a brand sponsorship in sight. Meanwhile, further south, desert dwellers had the opposite problem: sun, heat, sand in unimpressive places, and so scarves, robes, and veils became tools of physiological wisdom. Loose, flowing fabrics that shielded and ventilated, a walking design of intelligent airflow. But clothing was never just armor against the weather. As societies grew, what people wore began to say things. Not out loud, of course. That would be terrifying. But with subtle whispers of rank, role, and local flair. Linen in Egypt? You were probably pretty cool. Wool in Rome? Practical and respectable. Wearing a hat meant you were someone important, or at least had something to hide underneath. In medieval Europe, the sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what and in what quantities. These were officially fashion laws. Let that lull you. Imagine a kingdom where a tailor could accidentally cause treason by sewing too many gold threads into a tunic. Not the most exciting battlefield, but history is full of such silent skirmishes. Clothing also influenced human relationships. Wearing the wrong color could sour a family dinner. Donning the correct pattern might win you a spouse. Some romantic sparks were struck not by shared ideals or subtle flirting, but by noticing someone's impeccable cloak length. Even pockets, those humble, sleepy fabric folds, carried historic weight. Most early clothes didn't have them, which led to the invention of pouches, belts, and later, the universally beloved fanny pack. The pocket revolution was slow but steady, a centuries-long whisper of practicality that eventually let humans walk with both hands full of snacks. And so it was, across millennia, that the soft rustling of cloth shaped who survived, who ruled, and who managed to avoid a particularly embarrassing draft. Even today, among skyscrapers and supermarkets, we still make 100 tiny decisions about what we wear, each a quiet echo of our ancestors deciding whether that loincloth looked better with or without the ceremonial rhinoceros serif. So next time you pull on your favorite sweatshirt or tuck into your slippers, know that you're participating in an ancient survival tactic disguised as comfort. And as night deepens around our cozy thoughts, we'll slip into the next layer of history's gentle oddities, where a rather unassuming act of hospitality may have changed the entire course of human cooperation. Picture this: a man in Rome, sometime around the 1st century, staring at his sandal while mentally reciting the grocery list. Wine, olives, honey cakes, maybe a few garum jars if he's feeling fancy. He's got a toga half draped, a light crust of yesterday's bread clinging to his tunic, and he's just decided not to go to the market. Why? Because the street smells funny and the neighbor's donkey seems aggressive today. And just like that, the Roman Empire carries on. Slightly less garum in one citizen's pantry, but no upheaval in sight. These moments, often brushed aside like crumbs off a philosopher's robe, are the background music of human survival. Not the grand speeches or decisive battles, but the soft, shuffling decisions. Skip the market. Try the lentils instead. Nap under the fig tree rather than debate politics. Nowhere does this subtle magic of choice shine more peculiarly than in the evolution of domestic animals, particularly cats. Yes, cats. The aloof roommates of humanity. Unlike dogs, who actively auditioned for the role of best friend by wagging their way into our hearts and trash pits, cats stumbled into civilization with the haughty reluctance of someone dragged to a work meeting that doesn't involve snacks. Early humans, trying to store grain and avoid starvation, noticed that their carefully hoarded harvests attracted rodents. Rodents, in turn, attracted cats. And cats, blissfully unaware of spreadsheets, taxes, or the politics of empire, just did their thing. They pounced, they lounged, and they occasionally stepped on things they really shouldn't have. There's a particular kind of soft poetry in the idea that entire civilizations flourished just a bit more securely because someone decided to tolerate a fuzzy little predator curling up on their shoe. Even more amusing is how these decisions wove into the very myths we told ourselves. In ancient Egypt, cats weren't just tolerated, they were venerated. Killing one, even by accident, might earn you a punishment severe enough to make your afterlife diary take a dramatic turn. Egyptians associated cats with the goddess Bastet, who represented protection, fertility, and domestic joy. In practical terms, the grain was safe, the rats were not, and the humans got to keep their bread. All thanks to a cat who neither knew nor cared about her divine reputation. That divine feline favoritism had rippling effects. Households felt safer, storerooms were more secure, and more grain meant better survival odds in lean years. It's the kind of delicate domino that makes history feel like a sleepy card trick. One moment you've got a grain bin and a clever cat, and the next you've got enough food stability to spend time inventing papyrus, bureaucracy, and the world's earliest do not disturb signs. And once again, it all circled around a modest decision made in countless homes across ancient lands. Keep the cat. Fast forward a few hundred years and a few thousand miles, and medieval Europe has a completely different take. Cats go from gods to witches' familiars suspiciously fast. Talk about a career pivot. But even amid the paranoia, practical peasantry prevailed. Farmers still let cats linger in barns and kitchens, despite harboring whispered fears that mittens might curse their laundry. After all, cursed turnips were still better than no turnips. It's uncanny how many pivotal advances in stability, agricultural, nutritional, even spiritual, rested on the kind of decision that feels too small to make a play about. Behold, says no ancient scroll ever, Marcus chose to ignore the cat puking on the mat, and thus the empire persisted another day. And yet, that's precisely how the threads are spun. Grain saved from mice, a basket kept intact, a child who ate better that winter, a woman who lived to tell bedtime stories, a gathering by firelight, small, cozy ripples that carried survival gently forward, wrapped in fur, if not always in gratitude. So now, as you imagine ancient hearths and flickering oil lamps, picture a cat, a content one half asleep, perched with complete disregard for your personal space. Because in a way, just letting that little nap happen change someone's winter, someone's odds, someone's story. And the next story, well, it starts with a few clay pots, a little rain, and a perfectly ordinary accident that somehow helped humans stick around. As you settle into this quiet corner of the night, wrapped in the gentle warmth of your favorite blanket, perhaps the same one you once swore could never fit in the washing machine. We turn now to a surprisingly soothing chapter in humanity's long flirtation with convenience, the invention of chairs. Yes, chairs. The noble household thrones, the quiet warriors of our lumbar, the silent sentinels of sedentary civilization. Far from being mere furniture, the decision to sit differently, or to sit at all, was a small hinge that swung open a surprisingly large door in the history of survival. While today, chairs may feel like background characters in your Netflix binge, their ancestors once determined who had status, whose back ached less after feasting, and who got to make the rules. Our journey starts in ancient Egypt, where the earliest known chairs were not so much for resting, but for declaring, "Look at me. I sit and therefore I am more important than you." Pharaohs perched upon ornate wooden seats carved with lions, sphinxes, and dramatic armrests that screamed, "I shan't be doing manual labor today." For the common folks, the ground would do just fine, assuming one could avoid the enthusiastic neighborhood scorpions. The Greeks came next, and while they introduced many great ideas, democracy, geometry, olive oil on nearly everything, they still preferred reclining to sitting. At a proper symposium, the ideal posture was sideways, elbow in a pillow, wine in hand, wisdom spilling from your mouth like olives from a toppled amphora. Chairs, they were for officials, teachers, and the occasional stubborn artisan with a love for lumbar support. Then came Rome, where things escalated, as they often did. The Roman curule chair, a glorified folding stool, became a symbol of power. It was elegant, portable, and frankly, not that comfortable, because comfort implied laziness, and a true Roman leader stood tall, even when sitting. This foldable throne was reserved for magistrates and emperors, and certainly not for those who scraped mosaics for a living. But it wasn't until the Middle Ages that chairs truly began to multiply like flat-pack furniture at a Scandinavian megastore. In cold, drafty halls where nobles plotted inheritances and feasted on suspicious meats, the chair became a key marker of privilege. The word chairman comes from this time, when literally being the one allowed to sit during a meeting meant you were in charge. Everyone else stood, perhaps to stay alert, or possibly to keep from freezing to the stone floor. For centuries, most of humanity accepted the chairless life. Sitting meant squatting, kneeling, or lounging extravagantly on the floor with textiles fluffed just enough to confuse modern archaeologists. But slowly, something shifted, especially around the Renaissance era. Not only did people become wildly enthusiastic about painting naked cherubs on ceilings, but they also grew fond of ideas like anatomy, posture, and back support. The humble chair began appearing in more homes, less as a statement of royal might, and more because people were frankly a bit tired. By the 18th century, chairs became democratized furniture. Craftsmen like Thomas Chippendale elevated chair-making into an art form, though sitting in one for too long might still result in regrets and a mild cramp. Soon, chairs found their way into parlors, cafes, and lecture halls. Suddenly, everyone got a seat, even women, philosophers, and moody poets who insisted on talking about the moon for hours. In time, with the Industrial Revolution humming in the background, chairs evolved to fit the needs of factory floors and office desks. Ergonomics slowly entered the conversation, awkwardly at first, much like an intern at a shareholder meeting. But where chairs truly took a weighty role in our continued survival was in the way they allowed us to gather, to sit and eat together, to discuss, to argue civilly, to type away at opportunities, to pause in contemplation. Of course, modern health pundits now warn us, sitting is the new smoking. And yet, as we lie here, timelessly horizontal, let us remember, the decision to sit, while seemingly minor, helped shape how we organize classrooms, parliaments, dinner parties, and even bedtime podcasts. Perhaps tomorrow, you will gaze upon your favorite chair, not as a clutter catcher or oddly creaky sentinel, but as a noble tribute to all those who came before and said, "Standing, not today." And now, as the world quiets and the cushions soften beneath imagined weight, we will drift gently toward another small, strange decision that once changed everything. Buckwheat. The humble grain that sounds like a breakfast food, dresses like a cereal, and isn't technically either. For centuries, this imposter seed worked its quiet magic from the shadows, feeding peasants, soothing stomachs, and, somewhat heroically, staving off scurvy. While feudal lords were busy jousting and commissioning tapestries of themselves looking fierce on horseback, the lower classes were simmering buckwheat into porridge and wondering if it was normal to dream about pancakes nightly. Buckwheat is what botanists, those party animals of the plant world, call a pseudo-cereal. It is not a grain in the traditional sense because it doesn't come from grass. It grows on a flowering plant, somewhat resembling the adolescent doodles of a daydreaming herbalist. But oh, how it grows. Hardy, fast, and frost-resistant buckwheat made itself right at home in cooler, less glamorous agricultural zones, regions where wheat gave up and oats sulked. Its rise to humble glory began in Asia, where Chinese farmers around 1000 BCE looked at the stubby little seeds and thought, sure, why not? They sowed it, it grew quickly, and it was ready for harvest faster than you could say, "Tell me more about photoperiodism." It was a modest crop, never demanding much, just a little land, low maintenance, and occasionally someone to say good job when it flowered all pretty in the fields. Eventually, buckwheat journeyed west, as travelers and traders carried sacks of it along the Silk Road. By the time it reached Europe, it had already picked up a few aliases, like a medieval spy with culinary ambitions. In France, it was known as blé noir, black wheat. In Russia, it became greshka, a national treasure and comfort food in bowl form. It was the Bruce Willis of grains, unpretentious, rugged, and always there to save the day. During the late Middle Ages, buckwheat was embraced by peasants throughout Eastern and Northern Europe, where the soil was a little stingy and the nights a bit too cold for pampered grains. Nobility stuck to their wheaten bread, crusty and refined, while the lower classes tucked into kasha, blinis, and hearty pancakes that could be fluffed or folded, depending on whether you were feeling fancy. And lest you think this humble foodstuff lacked flair, consider this: buckwheat honey, dark, rich, and with notes of mysterious earthiness. It charmed bees into buzzing poetry. In fact, some say a spoonful of buckwheat honey could outcure 2 loud cousins and a rowdy tavern night. But this isn't just a story about food. It's about how the small decisions, like recognizing the value in an odd-seeming seed, quietly shape survival. In times of famine, disease, or siege, buckwheat didn't wait for a thank you. It was swift to grow and packed with nutrients, rich in magnesium, protein, and antioxidants long before superfood became Instagrammable. It even had a flair for social rebellion. It didn't need fancy meals or sun-drenched climate. It gave people autonomy over their food. Plant it, wait about 12 weeks, harvest, and you had, if not a feast, at least a chance to keep going. And in the story of human endurance, sometimes that's all it takes. Even today, buckwheat quietly lingers in diets, from Japan's soba noodles to Brittany's savory galettes. It resists uniformity, or in buckwheat's case, monoculture, and thrives in biodiversity. Farmers still rotate it into their fields between cash crops, not just because of nostalgia, but because buckwheat still knows how to warm the soil, keep the bees happy, and feed a belly on a rainy Tuesday. Still, tucked between more glamorous grains and Instagram-ready avocados, buckwheat remains the shy hero of dinner tables, never demanding, simply showing up. A plain bowl of it, drizzled with butter or sautéed with onions, still tastes like history whispering, "We made it. We're still here." And maybe that's the lesson, softly placing itself beside you as your mind drifts slower. That sometimes the most unassuming paths lead to the steadiest resilience, and that enduring nourishment comes in many forms, some edible, some simply kind. Just as fields of delicate white blossoms once swayed gently in the wind, somewhere out past the last stone cottage, we too sway toward the next moment, where the next quiet detail of history lies waiting in a tea kettle warm memory. Beneath the flickering tallow light of a modest medieval hearth, someone once had to decide whether to risk starvation over the winter, or finally try eating that weird-looking tuber with all the eyes growing out of it. The potato, as it would come to be known, was not an obvious choice for dinner in 16th century Europe. It looked suspiciously like something a witch might curse you with, or that might sprout legs and run off if left too long in a root cellar. But alas, hunger, or perhaps sheer desperation, has a way of shaping culinary courage. The story of how the potato all but saved Europe is one of humble brilliance. Originally plucked from the soil of the Andean highlands over 7,000 years ago, the potato had already enjoyed a long and fruitful run with the Inca, before European explorers decided everything exotic probably belonged back home. But once it arrived on European shores, it received a most lukewarm welcome. Many people were suspicious of it. After all, it grew underground, didn't look like any existing edible plant, and, more problematically, belonged to the nightshade family, which, for the uninitiated, is a plant group that includes both tomatoes and things that can rather effectively murder you. Indeed, for years, people thought potatoes were poisonous. There was logic to this. If you ate the leaves or the green parts, you might feel slightly not alive. In some villages, potatoes were grown only as ornamental plants, or worse, dug up solely to feed livestock. That is, until clever decisions, many of them economic, some of them gastronomic, and all seemingly minor, began to turn the tide. One particularly charming myth centers on Frederick the Great of Prussia, who, according to legend, valued the potato so dearly that he had guards stationed around his potato fields, not to keep people out, but to entice them in. It was reverse psychology, fit for a bedtime heist caper. The peasants, seeing soldiers guarding something, assumed it must be valuable. Naturally, after sundown, they would sneak in to steal the crops, thus initiating a perfectly orchestrated royal marketing campaign. The potato went from suspect spud to edible elitist goodness in under a decade. Across the Channel, the British were a little harder to convince. It wasn't until 1795 during a food shortage caused by war with France, that the British Board of Agriculture encouraged the people to embrace the potato. Posters were printed, lectures were given, and one imagines, lukewarm mashed samples were served with suspicious stares. But eventually, the people accepted the tuber. And oh, how it paid off. Potatoes offered 3 magical qualities. They were nutritious, filling, and ridiculously high yield. Imagine a world where a family could plant a small plot and feed themselves with relatively little catastrophe. For humans used to backbreaking grain, cultivation, and poor soil conditions, potatoes were a game changer. You didn't need much land, you didn't need perfect weather, and if you were clever, you didn't even need to like the taste. You could mash it, bake it, fry it, or bury it under so much lard and onion it barely tasted recognizable. It was in Ireland, though, that the potato truly became a cornerstone of survival. By the late 1700s, it had become a dietary staple for the poor, offering more nutrition per acre than anything else. But as we often learn in bedtime tales, even the most reliable friends can betray us, or rather, be betrayed by fungi. The Great Famine of the 1840s emerged from over-reliance on a single potato variety, the Irish lumper. When Phytophthora infestans, a rather uncharismatic name for such a catastrophic blight, swept in, it wiped out crops and brought tragedy in waves. Millions emigrated, many perished, and governments oscillated between apathy and inadequacy. But even then, the potato's tale wasn't done. The famine revealed the risks of monoculture and disconnection from land diversity, a whispered warning from beneath the soil. And yet, humanity, in its slow, curious way, learned. Potatoes were not banished. They were diversified, studied, respected. The humble decision to try that awkward route centuries ago had reshaped not just what we eat, but how we think about the relationship between people and the plants they depend on. Agriculture was no longer just about surviving the next season. It was about planning for the seasons no one had dreamed of yet. So as you drift in the soft quiet of the evening, think of that first brave farmer, holding a clump of dirt and destiny, squinting skeptically at a tuber that looked like it might taste like wet rocks. They tried it anyway, and centuries later, we got fries. Somewhere beyond the curtain of night, other small decisions, just as oddly shaped, just as underestimated, await their own quiet revolutions. Of all the things that changed the trajectory of humanity, mysterious meteor impacts, sudden climate shifts, the invention of the cat video, it might surprise you to learn that one of the most quietly powerful forces was the humble queue. Yes, the act of standing in line. Really think about it. At some point, as humans began clustering together in ancient villages, then towns, then the nerve-rattling beehives we now call cities, people had to figure out how to wait. You can have a brilliant culture, a proud warrior class, and a groundbreaking irrigation system, but none of it works if 8 dozen people try to buy bread at the same time with elbows flying and egos puffing. So here's what happened. We discovered patience. In small marketplaces across Mesopotamia or the bazaars of Alexandria, humans began doing something revolutionary. Instead of mobbing the fig stand like hungry jackals, people began lining up roughly. Terribly uneven lines probably, with a lot of murmuring and the odd foot stomping. But still, lines. The queue may well be civilization's most underrated invention. It's essentially organized hope. And hope, as it turns out, is deeply contagious. Let us drift now to 18th century Britain, where society was formalizing this peculiar form of self-governance. The British, who had already perfected the tepid cup of tea and the subtle art of weather-based complaints, embraced the queue with quiet, stubborn pride. A culture built on obligation and boiled cabbage was well suited to a system where people waited their turn without being told. It was, after all, a small act of trust that your time would come. Without this delicate balance, London streets might have resembled something more like a pantalooned riot. But let's dreamskip eastward. In Edo period Japan, waiting your turn was less about patience and more about harmony. The cultural priority of harmony, made disorder not just inconvenient, but borderline, immoral. Picture a noodle stall nestled between two narrow buildings, lanterns swaying gently. A line forms, the kind that stretches around the corner. And yet, all is calm. People wait. They are serene. They are spiritually fortified by the potential of a really good bowl of soba. Now whisper hop through time to a Parisian bakery during the French Revolution. Bread shortages had turned the elegant queue into a tense lineup of hungry citizens, some of whom were probably muttering about the intricacies of guillotine maintenance. Here, patience turned brittle. The bread line evolved, in some places, into a kind of social barometer. Too long a wait, and you could spark civic unrest. Too short, and people might think the bread was suspiciously dry. Across cultures and centuries, queuing became more than logistics. It became symbolic. In post-war Soviet Union, the queue was practically its own form of currency. A line could form and stretch around a building, not because people knew what was being sold, but because everyone saw a line and assumed something valuable must be at the end of it. Joining a queue became a rational economic decision based on social cues. "Why are we standing here?" asked one person. "I have no idea," replied the next, "but let's find out together." What a lovely, baffling example of collective optimism. In the United States, as supermarkets rose and checkout counters flourished, queuing became mechanized. Enter the frustration of the which line will move faster dilemma. It is a rite of passage, standing behind someone attempting to pay with expired coupons and a personal anecdote about every item they've selected. Even today, people debate the merits of one long, winding queue versus several shorter ones. It's a kind of consumerist chess game played beneath the flickering fluorescence of modern life. And then came the digital age. Somewhere along the timeline, humans invented the digital waiting room, a place where your number is number 1237 and your estimated wait time is approximately 17 hours. And yet, we wait. We keep the tab open. Because queuing, either physically or virtually, is tethered to the learned belief that waiting brings reward. In a world gaudy with instant gratification, perhaps the true radical act is still to wait, and to trust that your bagel, your vaccine, your Broadway ticket, or your favorite online discounts will arrive in due course. Remarkable, isn't it, that something so small, standing in a line, could become a pillar of social order, that it could soothe our tribal instincts and teach us restraint, patience, cooperation, all built on the quiet pact that we wait together. And speaking of quiet pacts, our next dreamy detour will cradle us in the flickering candlelight of another surprisingly influential human decision, the invention of bedtime. But don't worry, that story's just beginning to yawn awake. In the warm haze of dawnlight, somewhere around the 12th century, a man blinked awake in the chilly stone stillness of his cottage. He yawned, scratched at a woolen shirt that was definitely not pre-shrunk, and made a decision that, while seemingly minor, would quietly ripple its way through the history of survival. he chose oatmeal over roasted turnips for breakfast. That's right, oatmeal. Not the sugared kind we know today with cinnamon and microwavable sass, but the real stuff, boiled, beige, bland, and also a nutritional powerhouse in an era where people usually survived on whatever they managed not to starve from. Grain cultivation, and more importantly, how we decided to cook it, was one of the most critical forkfuls in human progress. Because it's not just what you eat, it's how your village decides to eat it. Grains like barley, rye, oats, and wheat were miracles of density. You could store them through winter, trade them, grind them, ferment them. Oh yes, we will get to the fermentation. But first, porridge. Now, delightful though it is to consider medieval folks filing into the local oat hall with their wooden bowls, let's look at the sleepy magic tucked within that choice. Porridge was practically a slow-release energy spell. It kept people alive during frigid mornings in Northern Europe, gave workers the stamina to swing axes at trees, those poor, innocent trees, and sustained countless sleepy children through Latin lessons and lice inspections at monastic schools. It was basically the Wi-Fi of the Middle Ages. You didn't think about it. But if it disappeared, society collapsed. Meanwhile, in warmer climates, choices about cooking fat had their own ripple effects. Olive oil in the Mediterranean wasn't just a flavor flex. It was edible energy, antiseptic, and stain remover in one badly labeled amphora. Families cultivated olive trees not merely for salad dressing, but as a multi-generational investment. That clunky jug in your ancestor's kitchen, that was Grandpa's retirement plan. And oh, how human history unfolded in kitchens. Take the decision to bake or boil dough. In one part of the world, people flattened it into discs and tossed it on hot stones, flatbreads, naan, pita. In others, they fermented the dough and invented ovens, giving rise, quite literally, to bread. This wasn't just gastronomy. This was chemistry, technology, the earliest food science with zero peer review and a lot of accidental fire. The thing is, as our ancestors made cooking decisions, they weren't just chasing flavor. They were hunting shelf life, digestibility, and mold resistance. Even spices weren't just for swagger. They were early preservatives. Those nutmeg-drenched Tudor meat pies? Delicious, yes, but also cloaked in spices to disguise the fact they'd been sitting in the larder since Henry VIII was still on his first wife. In East Asia, fermentation turned soybeans into miraculous things like miso and soy sauce. In other words, someone long ago left beans in a damp crock for too long, sniffed them, and thought, perhaps this is delicious. And it was. Often, survival meant ignoring your nose and trusting your instincts. That's bravery in a bowl. But let us also tip our flattened traveling caps to those who figured out how to boil water. A simple idea today, but for early humans trying to deparasite their lives one ladle at a time, it was revolutionary. Herbs went into the pot not just for flavor, but as hopeful medicinal Hail Marys. Was it a soup, a tonic, a potion? Honestly, it depended who was stirring it. Decisions like when to eat, what to cook, and how to store it became invisible rituals passed through generations. These weren't grand empires or golden thrones, but the quiet tinkering of meals that stopped your cousin from dying of scurvy. That impressive. And as the centuries simmered on, even cutlery became decision-making battlegrounds. The fork, once considered dangerously prissy in Europe, was gradually accepted, mainly because saucy things needed taming. Earlier humans just used bread as a scoop or their fingers. But as manners evolved, so did table tools. It turns out the shift from grab with hand to delicately stab with prongs mirrored the shift from survival to culture. A fork was more than metal. It symbolized the time and luxury to worry about posture over soup. So, with each bite chosen, each pot stirred, and each spoon carved, humanity cooked its way through complexity, one extremely chewy lentil at a time. Our ancestors may not have had nutritional labels, but their decisions crafted a culinary lineage, less about taste, more about staying alive, and maybe, at the very end of a long day, comforting each other with something warm in a bowl. And so, let the scent of simmering barley and ancient spices carry you gently into the next chapter, where a different kind of artifact would quietly shape the future. The humble chair. But there, we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, rest and let your dreams stew slowly, like the world's coziest soup. Somewhere in the middle of a perfectly ordinary spring morning in Florence, Italy, in the year 1478, a man sat down to eat a plum and accidentally helped shape the future of commerce. His name has long been forgotten, but what he did is still with us today. He asked for change. Not emotional change, not personal growth, just change. A few smaller coins in exchange for one large, unwieldy one. He wanted to buy a plum. One, just one. And the plum seller didn't have enough small coins for change. That tiny inconvenience, an everyday hassle barely worth a complaint, was happening all over Renaissance Europe. And rather than accept a world in which fruit purchases were this inefficient, people started thinking. And so began the steady march toward the modern banking system. Let's drift gently now into the soft candlelit ledgers of the Medici Bank. Their offices were not unlike a quiet sanctuary for paperwork, where numbers were whispered like holy prayers and ink pots were guarded more closely than family secrets. The Medicis weren't just a wealthy family. They were the Beyoncé of the Renaissance economy. And they weren't alone. Merchant banking exploded because of small decisions by everyday people. Medieval cloth traders wanted to avoid carrying enormous sacks of coins on risky roads infested with precisely the kind of people who liked enormous sacks of coins. They began using letters of credit, first awkward and suspicious, then gradually trusted. These delicate paper promises evolved into complex financial tools. But let's not get too excited. No one's going to dream peacefully about compound interest. Still, it's worth pausing to note that these little financial inventions were basically survival tactics. Safer trading wasn't just about thriving economically. It was about making sure you didn't end up on the disappointing end of a sword while trying to buy some silk. Let's float now to the silent hum of an accounting office in 16th century Venice, where clerks sat diligently under the sleepy eyes of their cats, carving numbers into books with the precision of surgeons. In this sleepy, sea-gated republic, something surprisingly exciting happened. Double-entry bookkeeping. Now, I know, that doesn't sound like pillow talk, but it quite literally kept economies afloat. Double-entry bookkeeping meant that merchants could keep track not just of what they spent, but of what they owed. It was like giving the world a financial memory, so that it didn't just buy things, it could reflect on them afterward. All of a sudden, every little merchant could pretend to be a philosopher. "Ah yes," they muttered to themselves, dusting flour from their robes. "This amount I spent on barley, 'tis balanced by this debt I accrued from Alberto, whose ship sank. Tragic, but economically significant. And thus, thanks to the hum of ledgers and a few thousand plum-related inconveniences, capitalism very gently rolled out of bed. But if we zoom out a bit more, we'll see this everyday decision-making wasn't limited to bankers or buyers of dubious fruit. No, across the world, quietly and without fanfare, people were creating systems to save themselves time, effort, and, quite often, embarrassment. Take the humble queue, the line. Standing in the formation, patiently, somewhat annoyed but civil, waiting your turn for a service or a sausage roll. Lines didn't always exist, you know. Ancient marketplaces were chaos, based more on elbow aggression and the volume of one's voice than any structured system. But eventually, people noticed something. When everyone tried to get everything at once, nobody got anything at all. Somewhere in a soggy market square, likely while standing in muddy shoes, someone said, "What if we just went one at a time?" Thus was born perhaps the most polite invention in human history. It seems like nothing, but queuing, this quiet agreement to trade time fairly, allowed societies to function better with less screaming and shoving. It was the social glue that made modern cities endurable. From financial ledgers to fruit-related frustrations, from the birth of banking to the quiet majesty of the civilized queue, human survival wasn't ensured only by big wars or bold kings, but also by soft revolutions in courtesy, caution, and a touch of greed paper-clipped neatly to common sense. And now, as night folds its softness across the ledger of the sky, and the stars begin to faintly spark like the glint of loose coins under candlelight, we'll drift toward another kind of invention, one not of cues or credit, but of curiosity and clever little cheats. After all, where would we be without the charming mischief of shortcuts? Outside a narrow alehouse in 18th century Edinburgh, 3 philosophers debated the nature of the human soul, while inside, a fireplace snapped cheerfully, and a sleepy spaniel snored beside a dented bucket of pickled onions. The philosophers, of course, were unpaid and uninvited, as most philosophers tended to be. But inside the tavern, more consequential things were proceeding slowly. Namely, the fine art of decision-making while halfway through a pie. It is a little-known truth, tragically overlooked in textbooks and annual reports, that human survival owes an enormous debt to split-second decisions made in kitchens, campsites, and crooked alleyways. Let's drift back through the fog of time and peek in on a few such moments. Let us start with a simple medieval moment. A blacksmith's apprentice in Normandy chooses to wear his right shoe on his left foot, simply because it was closer to the bed that morning. He grumbles all day about the discomfort, and quite understandably. But this odd choice, if we skip forward through the palimpsest of timelines, indirectly leads to a subtle limp preventing him from joining a war band. That war band rides into a battle and loses spectacularly, to the extent that ballads are written by losers' widows. And through this one aching foot, the boy lives, marries, has kids, and, through generations and some rather dubious marriages, becomes the great-great-something uncle of a woman who eventually invents a durable fabric called denim. And so, indirectly, we find that blue jeans owe something to a mismatched pair of boots. Not all decisions were so clumsy and fortunate. In Ming Dynasty China, one merchant, let's call him Wen, had to decide between carrying salt or silk on his next trade route. Though salt was more profitable that season, he was fond of the silk vendor's jokes, so silk it was. 3 weeks later, a flash flood washed away the salt caravan. Meanwhile, Wen's silk, fragrant with cedar from the caskets he transported it in, enchanted a local noble too rich to care about the dye bleeding in the rain. As a thank you, the noble passed down a family recipe for pain-relieving ointment, which, some suspect, eventually made its way into modern-day vapor rub. From near disaster sprang soothing menthol, and to think, all because someone liked a good yarn and a clever pun. Now, decision-making wasn't always so literal. Sometimes it was spoken in glances or grumbles or the tilt of a soup spoon. Imagine early 19th century Prussia, where everything was spiked, the helmets, the mustaches, and possibly even breakfast forks. One military quartermaster was tasked with rationing out cheese for an army drill. Given the choice between soft or hard cheese, he rolled his eyes, historically, and chose hard. Why? Soft cheese takes time, hard cheese bounces, and his soldiers were late. That decision, though unremarkable at the time, avoided an outbreak of dairy-borne illness that had secretly been lurking in the camembert. Thus, the misaligned clocks of lazy soldiers and firm cheddar safeguarded a regiment. The next year, those very soldiers were the key to reorganizing municipal plumbing in Lower Saxony. The human butterfly effect has never been so lactose dependent. Of course, sometimes survival came down to not making a decision at all. There's a story from ancient Egypt of a scribe who paused for 15 minutes while choosing which reed pen he'd use to copy down a grain inventory. The pause, necessitated by an argument with a particularly aloof cat, meant he was not present when a Nile crocodile made an enthusiastic attempt on the thigh of a courier. Survival, in this case, happened because the cat won the argument, and in Reykjavik, in the 1920s, a man who did not go fishing on Thursdays, not for superstition, but because he preferred to re-oil his boots, never failed to return home dry. When asked, he'd simply say, "The ocean doesn't miss me." He survived to be 93, smoked a pipe floral enough to make birds sneeze, and never once regretted his non-fishing Thursdays. It's tempting to think only the grand sweeping choices of history guide humanity's fate. Battles, treaties, revolutions, and cocktails with too many ingredients. But more often, it's the decisions we make without realizing. The boot placed here instead of there. The pause to pet the goat. The stubborn refusal to eat one more pickled onion. These soft, quiet choices, unnoticed and unsung, swirl through history like dream threads, stitching the quilt of all we know and all we are. And speaking of quiet choices, there's one more we ought to consider. Let's trace an odd turn in a dusty corner of Sicily, where a forgotten decision, made over a teacup and a terribly drawn map, led to something extraordinary. There's something delightfully human about trying to do things the hard way. Take, for instance, the brilliant minds of the 17th century, who went to extraordinary lengths to build accurate clocks, ones that could keep time at sea in storms, in pitch-black hulls rocking with the Atlantic. They had gears etched and hand-cut by candlelight, weights machined thinner than sovereigns, and pendulums that danced like drunken gentlemen at a Christmas party. And all this toil, all this horological heroism, because they wanted, desperately, to know one thing: where they were on the map. Longitude. That was the mystery they were solving. Not the meaning of life, not the secrets of the stars, but simply how far they drifted from Greenwich on a Tuesday. You see, mankind thrives on the little decisions, like slicing bread before toasting it or stacking bricks just so. And somewhere in the ebb and flow of whispered centuries, these micro-choices began shaping something much larger than breakfast or buildings. They began shaping survival itself. Consider the curious case of medieval chimney design. Once upon a soggy European winter, someone had the gloriously bright idea to steer smoke up and out of a hut, rather than letting it meander through the ceiling like an overly friendly ghost with sinus issues. That choice not only saved lungs, but gradually redefined architecture, cooking, and even insurance. A chimney, just a tube for smoke, but also a silent hero in the long novel of human continuity. And then there was the humble fork. Ah yes, the scandalous fork. When it pranced its way into Western Europe from Byzantium, it was considered a feat, a delicate instrument for dainty fingers, perhaps Satan's own cutlery. People whispered, priests frowned. Why not stab your meat with a knife like a normal 11th century knight? But bit by bit, the fork won. It kept hands clean. It offered precision. It let you look ever so slightly more civilized while disassembling a roast. That minor improvement at the dinner table led to more refined table manners, and, if we stretch optimism, a world better equipped to layer etiquette over chaos. Even empires, after all, are held together by what we agree not to do over lunch. Or take the ancient bed. Not particularly glamorous, I grant you, but deeply influential. Early beds were more communal than comfortable. Planks tossed with straw, often shared with fleas, cats, and the occasional neighbor. Then came innovations, elevated frames, wool mattresses, cozy furs. Better sleep led to sharper thinking, less illness, and, most critically, fewer marital arguments at 1 a.m. about who stole the blanket. It's a deliciously sleepy truth of history. We got better by deciding to be slightly less uncomfortable. 1 extra stitch in a hem, 1 more notch in a belt, 1 cleaner gulp of water. Survival didn't always roar. Sometimes it just murmured, maybe put a lid on that pot. Even cities followed suit. The winding alleys of Rome, originally shaped by goat paths and whimsy, evolved into road networks that inspired the very concept of infrastructure. Turning a muddy shortcut into a stone-paved boulevard wasn't merely an aesthetic choice. It was a gamble on the future, a bet that someone would walk that way again. And they did, carrying news, grain, legions, or recipes. All thanks to choices made so gradually that no one thought history was being written at all. So here you are, listening while tucked beneath your own version of the evolved bed. Your matrix of pillows arranged just so, your favorite side claimed, your device dimmed to a murmur. You are the outcome of those little decisions, the gentle sum of humanity's clever habit of adjusting, iterating, and just slightly improving the status quo. And while the grand histories sing of wars and reigns, it's this quiet saga, the one of forks and socks, of chimneys and clocks, that truly cradles us into the present. Now drift gently beneath the blanket of time. Let the tick of the old clocks lull you. Let the forks lie still, the chimney smoke curl harmlessly skyward, and the road wait patiently under moonlight. Sleep now, time, traveler. The map no longer matters. You're exactly where you need to be.